Today, we're opening the case file on one of history's most powerful and, let's be honest, most controversial institutions, the papacy. This is an office that has shaped empires, guided billions of people, and has managed to stick around for nearly 2,000 years.
But how on earth did it all begin? I mean, really, how does one man, the Bishop of Rome, end up becoming the spiritual leader for more than 1 billion people today? How do you go from a fisherman in ancient Galilee to the modern pope? Okay, let's dive in and really unpack the evidence behind this extraordinary claim.
So our investigation has to start at the very beginning. We need to look at the foundational belief that basically underpins the entire structure of the Catholic Church.
And here it is. The core idea is called the Papacy, and it's all built on this concept of apostolic succession. The belief is pretty straightforward, really. Jesus chose St. Peter to lead his church here on earth, and that specific, unique authority has been passed down, person to person, through an unbroken line of the bishops of Rome for centuries. So you have to ask, where does a claim that huge even come from? Well, for that, we need to turn to our Exhibit A. This is the primary biblical passage that sits right at the heart of the whole matter.
This is it. This is the moment, right here in the Gospel of Matthew, that the Catholic Church points to as the divine birth certificate of the papacy. This is Jesus speaking directly to his disciple, a guy named Simon, who he then renames Peter.
Now let's break down what's happening here, because the language is packed with meaning. First, you've got the name change. Simon becomes Peter, or Petros, which literally means rock. So he's meant to be the solid, visible foundation. Second, the keys. In the ancient world, this was a massive deal. It was an unmistakable symbol of authority. Think of a prime minister who holds the keys to the kingdom. And finally, there's this power to bind and loose. This was understood as the authority to make binding, official decisions for the whole community.
Okay, so that's the biblical claim. It's a big one. But did the early Christians actually act like the Bishop of Rome was in charge? Did they get the memo? Let's follow the historical trail and see what we find. Well, it turns out we see evidence for a special role for Rome's bishop really early on. Get this, around 96 AD, that's decades before the Bible was even fully put together, the Bishop of Rome, Pope Clement, writes a strong letter to the church way over in Corinth to settle a major dispute they were having. Historians look at that as one of the first real examples of papal authority in action. Fast forward a few hundred years, and this authority gets way more explicit. And boom, here's a perfect example. This is pretty much a mic drop moment in church history. At this huge, important meeting, the Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD, a letter from Pope Leo the Great in Rome was read out loud. And this was the reaction from all the other bishops gathered there. They didn't just say, "Hey, good point, Leo." They said, "Peter has spoken through Leo." They were basically saying the voice of the first pope was still speaking through his successor.
All right, but no case this big is without some serious challenges. To really get our heads around the papacy, we have to put it on the stand and look at the toughest counter-arguments out there, and of course, the theological defenses against them. So, let's head into the cross-examination.
And first up is a big one. It's right there in the Bible. The Apostle Paul publicly and pretty harshly confronts Peter for his behavior. So critics ask, logically, if Peter can be so wrong that he gets called out in public, how can he possibly be some kind of infallible pope?
Okay, so the defense here all comes down to a really crucial distinction: the difference between infallibility and impeccability. The doctrine never, ever claims that popes are perfect or that they can't sin. Impeccability means sinless. That's not the claim. Infallibility is about being protected from officially teaching an error when it comes to faith and morals. Paul was calling Peter out for his actions, his hypocrisy, not for some formal doctrine he was laying down. In fact, the defense flips this around and says the whole incident actually proves Peter's importance. Why? Because if Peter wasn't the leader, his bad example wouldn't have been such a catastrophic problem for the whole church.
Okay, next up is what many critics see as the historical smoking gun. A guy named Pope Honorius I. After he died, he was actually condemned by a later church council for supporting a heresy. So, a pope being officially called a heretic? Surely that just shatters the whole idea of infallibility, right? Game over?
Well, to understand the defense, we first have to look at the very specific rules for what makes a papal statement infallible. It only counts when a pope speaks ex cathedra, which means from the chair. And there are conditions, a checklist really. The pope has to be speaking as the supreme pastor. He has to be officially defining a doctrine. It has to be about faith or morals, and it has to be for the entire church to hold as true. So, let's run Pope Honorius through that checklist. Did his problematic letters concern faith and morals? Yeah, check. Were they binding on the church? You could argue yes. Check. But, and this is the absolute key to the whole defense, did he solemnly define a doctrine? And the answer, defenders say, is a clear no. His letters were seen as ambiguous, maybe even just his private opinion, but not a formal, binding definition made from the chair of Peter. So the verdict on Honorius, from this perspective, is this. Yeah, he was a bad pope. He was negligent. His failure to act allowed a heresy to spread, and for that, he was rightly condemned. But he never used the full protected authority of his office to officially teach that heresy and bind the entire church to it. Infallibility in this view is like a safety net. It stops a pope from forcing the whole church into error, but it doesn't stop him from being a flawed human or a poor leader.
So to sum up our entire investigation, the case for the papacy really stands on three legs. A specific interpretation of Jesus' words to Peter, supported by historical examples of Rome acting with unique authority, and defended against some very tough criticisms with very precise theological definitions.
And all of that leaves us with the final question, the one at the heart of it all. Is this 2,000-year-old institution the result of a divine promise, made to a fisherman and miraculously preserved through the chaos of history? Or is it a human tradition, an institution that grew in power over centuries, built on top of that history? That's the question the evidence leaves us with. Thanks for digging into this with me.